we're gonna try and do different things today. But before we start, we just want to sort of take a moment to reflect on the discussion topic, which is a really difficult one. And those of you who are attending today may be coming to this from different positions. Maybe you're just curious to try and look at the topic in a bit more detail. Maybe you have some lived experience of it. Maybe it's affected somebody close to you or a work colleague. And our goal here, just as a disclaimer, isn't to give direct clinical advice, but just to start a conversation that hopefully you carry on from today. An hour really isn't a lot of time to begin to sort of discuss a topic like suicide prevention. So it's our hope that you take this conversation forward and continue it past today. So today's great in the sense that it invites us all to pause and reflect on it, but this is also something that we'd encourage you to take forward beyond today. Suicide prevention and thinking about suicide is a really difficult thing to do for lots of different reasons. So we just wanted to acknowledge that some of you may find it difficult today, and that's absolutely understandable and fine. If you want to just pause and come off the webinar, we're really keen that you look after yourself during this discussion. So if you did want to take some time out, that's absolutely fine. Don't worry about just dropping out. And we wanted to sort of bookend the discussion today with signposting you to some support. So this will be one of the first slides and the last slides that we show, just in case you do feel like you want to drop out. What we want to do today is to sort of support you to get more support, whether that's information or if it's getting you some support in your own right. And you'll see there some of the organizations that support these types of conversations. And we'd encourage you to reach out to those organizations if you're struggling yourself or if you're supporting someone that's struggling. And you'll see there's contact details for Samaritans, Calm and Shout. If you're concerned about getting help for yourself or for someone else, then please do book an appointment with your GP or reach out to mental health services. That's always a good starting point to try and initiate some contact with a healthcare professional. So now we've got all that out of the way, we're just going to sort of take some time to really think about changing the narrative. And again, it's important to acknowledge that there's lots of attempts to try and change the way that we understand suicide. So just in very simplistic terms, just changing the language that we use when we're talking about this topic. And you may see lots of references to the comment of committing suicide being changed to death by suicide. So there are many attempts to sort of change the way that we approach this topic because it's difficult to talk about it. And oftentimes we may avoid having a conversation about it for fear of not knowing how to respond. It's quite overwhelming sometimes when you're trying to support somebody and they express distress in this way. So it's absolutely understandable that people may try and avoid the conversation in the first place because they're not really sure how to respond. And we'll look at some things that you might be able to do a bit later. Again, this isn't clinical advice. It's just sort of general comments about how you might start the process of trying to support somebody. I think we'll have some opportunity for questions right at the end. We'll try and get through as many as we can, but that really just depends on timing today. What we want to try and do is to equip you with a deeper understanding of some of the risk factors that are associated with suicide, how you can pay attention to those risk scenarios, and how you might invite somebody to seek support, or how you might enable them to get support for themselves. So that's the plan for today, but yeah, we'll try and get to your questions right at the end.
Absolutely. So first and foremost, we just wanted to touch on the statistics. Suicide is a deeply tragic event and it has wide-reaching consequences. sadly, it is one of the leading causes of death globally at the moment, with more than 700,000 people dying by suicide every year across the world. And it's important to recognise that suicide can be unique to each individual. It's sometimes triggered by a sudden traumatic event, or other times by a long-standing mental health struggle. Unfortunately, research has shown that 73% of individuals who died by suicide between 2010 and 2020 in the UK were not in contact with mental health services at the time of their death. And this underlines the critical need for not only broader awareness, but also empowering people like me, like you, like your colleagues, to open that conversation with people you're worried about and give people the opportunity to talk about how they're feeling, in the hope that we can reach people who may not be able to reach out for help themselves, for whatever reason that might be. And I'm gonna hope, it's not gonna work. I had a slide here ready for you to input some suggestions. It's not going to work. In the chat panel, if you're able to, I just wanted to ask what you thought of who was most at risk of suicide. What, in your opinion, might make someone at risk of suicide? And obviously, we'd ask you to keep your comments respectful of everybody else. But if you had any thoughts about what might make someone at risk of suicide, what might that be? Yeah, we've got some comments coming through. So gender, isolation, financial pressures, lack of support. Somebody saying they don't think there is any typical person who's at risk, which is a really insightful comment. Age, relationships, bereavement, everyone is at risk. Yeah, some really good comments coming through showing that ultimately lots of people are at risk, and there are a lot of risk factors to be aware of. There are some risk factors that can make people have a higher risk of suicide, but it's also important to remember that just because someone fits into one of these risk categories, it does not mean that they are definitely going to take their own life. Risk factors can increase vulnerability, but they don't predetermine the outcome. And so obviously everybody's individual circumstance is different. So we've kind of got three sections of risk factors. We've got gender here. Quite a few of you said that in the comments. In the UK, like many other places in the world, men are 3 or 4 times more likely to die by suicide than women. And this disparity is often attributed to multiple factors, including societal expectations around men and masculinity, reluctance to seek help, and exposure to more lethal means. Age is also a risk factor. Middle-aged men, particularly those between 45 and 59, are at the highest risk of suicide. And again, this can be due to many different factors, including financial stress, relationship breakdowns, or declining physical health. It's also important to note that suicide was the leading cause of death for men aged 20 to 34 in 2021. And so age and gender are a real significant risk factor that we need to be aware of. Socioeconomic status is also a real risk factor, with those living in areas of deprivation facing a much higher risk of suicide than those elsewhere. Now, this is likely due to limited access to healthcare, higher rates of unemployment, and greater exposure to social and economic stressors. And the statistics around this show that the most deprived 10% of the UK are more than twice as likely to die by suicide than the least deprived 10%. And so that is a really big risk factor for people. Psychological factors, existing mental health conditions greatly increase an individual's risk of suicide, as does substance misuse. And that can be a real increase in risk. A history of trauma as well, be that physical, emotional, sexual abuse, or the impact of significant loss, can profoundly affect an individual's mental health and increase their risk of suicide. Societal and environmental factors, access to lethal means such as firearms or medications, combined with social isolation, which was something that a number of you mentioned, and an exposure to stressful life events can create a dangerous environment for someone who's already struggling. Previous suicide attempts are also, unfortunately, a strong prediction of future risk. And there's also some contextual considerations in terms of things like economic downturns. So during the economic downturn in 2007 to 2013, there was a rise in suicide rates as well. Adam, is there anything you'd like to add at this point from a kind of more of a clinical point of view?
Yeah, I guess just to sort of reiterate what you've said, Lizzie, that when we look at the literature, we see so many different risk factors that can exist in isolation or coexist. So it's often the case that you see a number of these things in somebody's life that can contribute to taking that action. But it's also important to notice that that's not the case for everybody. Some people will experience mental health difficulties, have problems with substance abuse, financial difficulties, but will not self-injure or attempt to take their own life. So it's a pretty complicated picture that we're looking at here, and people's risk varies over time. And there can be things which only that person knows about them. They may not be communicated to other people. So when we say it's a personal experience, that's really true. It's such a personal experience.
Yeah.
But the thing that we know is it's a method of, communicating distress, isn't it? And we'll look at that a bit later on.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'd like to touch on things for you as an individual. What can you be looking out for if you are worried about someone, a loved one or a colleague? And firstly, it's important to say that this is not an exhaustive list, is it, Adam? This is kind of just some things that people can look out for. And I'll allow Adam to kind of talk you through this list and key warning signs that you could be looking out for in terms of people you're worried about.
Yeah, I mean, again, there are perhaps certain indicators or risk signs or early warning signs that might alert you to the fact that somebody's experiencing some distress. But again, there may be things that you've noticed in people around you that don't fall onto this list. So this is, as Lizzie says, by no means an exhaustive list, but nevertheless, these are things that the literature and our own clinical experience tells us are signs that something's not quite as it should be for the person. Really, what we're interested in here is a change in presentation, and what we describe as an atypical behavior. So if you've noticed, for example, that somebody historically has been quite outgoing and quite socially interactive, and then all of a sudden you notice that they're perhaps a bit more withdrawn, or that they avoid social contact, or that they seem to be quite anxious in their interactions with others, that's a change in their usual presentation. So it's an atypical change in the way that they usually are. And that may be a signal that they're experiencing some sort of distress. It might not be, but nevertheless, it tells you that something perhaps isn't quite as it should be, and therefore it's an opportunity to try and explore that in more detail with them. Other things might relate to an increase in maladaptive behaviours to cope with their level of distress. So Lizzie mentioned earlier that you may see the onset of excessive drinking or illicit drug use, or that people may drink more than they usually do, or smoke more than they usually do. Again, that's atypical for that person. It might be the way that they communicate with you. So the way that they describe things seems to be very different from how they used to. So you may get more verbal expressions of hopelessness. You may see them use expressions like, what's the point? There's no point in me doing this thing anymore. I just can't go on. Those are all signals in their language, in their interaction with you, that perhaps are a signal of distress. We might look at changes in relation to sleeping patterns or eating patterns. If you live with somebody, then you may notice a change in their sleep. They may sleep a lot more than usual or sleep a lot less. They may eat a lot more or eat a lot less. So it's a deviation from what you would usually see with someone. Those are all things that you might take as evidence that something is happening for that person. It's a signal of distress, and it's an opportunity to start a conversation with them about why there's a perceived change. So those are some of the things that you might want to be mindful of if you see them in your family members, colleagues, or in your network.
So we've also got, Adam's just touched on these, there's the kind of direct and indirect verbal clues that you might pick up on. Like you've just said, Adam, there's the kind of more direct things like I can't go on anymore, or there's other things like what's the point and you'd be better off without me. In these moments, it's really important to actively listen to people, give people your full attention and try to really understand what they're saying. It can also be helpful to repeat what someone said back to them to make sure you're clarifying what they've said and that you understand what they're meaning. And reflecting it back on some people can also mean, you know, if they say, you'd be better off without me, and you say, you think we'd be better off without you, what do you mean by that? They might immediately correct you and say, oh, no, I'm not, I don't mean in that way, I'm not thinking about suicide. Or some people might say, yes, I am. And it's a really good time to really clarify what's going on for people. So one of the most effective ways that we can prevent suicide is just to start the conversation, just to ask somebody. This can feel really daunting, especially if you're worried about saying the wrong thing, or if you've never had this conversation with someone before. However, it is better to ask someone than to say nothing at all. Research shows that asking someone if they're thinking about suicide does not increase their risk of them attempting it, and actually it's the exact opposite. And it can be a relief for them to have the opportunity to talk about their feelings. The most important thing, first and foremost, is to choose an appropriate time and place for a conversation like this. The hallway at work or somewhere very public is probably not an appropriate place. It's not going to give people the sense of privacy or comfort that they'll need. You could start by inviting them somewhere quiet and private, saying, you know, I've noticed you seem a bit down lately. I'd like to check in. Shall we go for a coffee or a walk? Or you know, invite them somewhere that allows them to have that privacy to open up with you. It's also really important to let someone know that you care about them. You're asking them about this from a place of concern and not from a place of judgment. So using your own words, you could say something like, you're important to me and I'm worried about you. And the idea is to let them know they are not worthless and that they contribute meaningfully to the lives of other people. You know, things like, is everything okay? I care about you. I wanted to check in. How are you really feeling? Please don't make anyone feel guilty by saying things like, I'd be really upset if you did X, Y, or Z, because it's not about making them responsible for your feelings. It's important to let them know that you care. And then just ask them how they've been feeling. Depending on what they say, you could ask kind of gentle probing questions, such as, do you think it's possible for you to feel better? Or who or what makes you feel better? Are there times when you feel quite desperate? How often does that happen? These questions don't have the word suicide directly in them, and therefore for you as the person asking them, it feels a little bit easier to ask because it's a little bit less confrontational, but also it feels quite natural. And it can also help the person identify times and places where they, you know, do feel better and they do have something kind of hope to hold on to. Are there any other pointers here that you'd include, Adam?
Yeah, I think we should acknowledge that it's really difficult as the recipient here when you get a statement that is suggestive of harm. So it's really overwhelming when you're listening to a comment that might relate to somebody's safety. And it's overwhelming in the sense that you're probably uncertain about what to do. And the key thing here is nobody's expecting you to solve the problem. Nobody's expecting you to give clinical advice. What we're suggesting is that just listening can have such a powerful impact for somebody. Some people might not really know what they're telling you. They haven't really organized their thoughts appropriately. And that's part of the discussion, to help somebody come to some sort of conclusion about the way that they're thinking and feeling. And if you can't do that, you could be the enabler. The enabler in this sense might mean that you could signpost somebody to a mental health resource or support them to go and attend their GP. So but nobody's expecting you to sort of manage the situation. It's really just, it's oftentimes, the avoidance of doing things wrong, which is to shut down the conversation or to avoid it altogether, because then we can't change anything. So just simply knowing, and as Lizzie says, just reaffirming somebody's current level of distress, and then giving them perhaps some options in terms of talking again about it or seeking support, can have a really profound impact on their thoughts that somebody's taken what they say seriously and somebody's invested in trying to help them.
Absolutely, thank you. So again, I'm sorry my Slido isn't working. It just makes it a little less interactive. But if you are worried about someone, do you think you should ask them about if they have any thoughts of harming themselves or not? Again, please feel free to put your answers in the chat. I think we've already touched on this, so hopefully everybody knows. Yes, lots of yeses coming through. That's good. Ultimately, obviously approach the conversation with sensitivity and care and empathy, but also with directness. Phrases like, are you thinking about suicide? Or it sounds like you're going through a really tough time. Have you thought about ending your life? Open the door for an honest dialogue. It's important to listen without judgment, like we've both already said. Don't try and solve their problems immediately or offer platitudes like it's going to be okay, because we don't know that, and you can't fix it, and you're not responsible for fixing it. All you're doing is acknowledging their feelings and letting them know that you're there to support them. So asking them the questions like we said on the previous slide, and trying to understand where they are before helping them access services that can support them on an ongoing basis. So after a disclosure, the needs of a person who is struggling with suicidal thoughts really depends on the circumstances, and this will be individual to every situation. There isn't kind of a guidebook or a playbook that we can give you, but these are our kind of 4 steps that would apply to most situations. You can obviously provide the supportive presence in a conversation environment free of judgment, which creates the safe space for them to feel their feelings and express themselves. Also, some people might just want to sit in silence and have you sat next to them after they've talked about what's happening for them, and that's okay, as long as they feel that they're able to open up and talk to you about how they've been feeling. The most important thing you can do is remain calm. Now that sounds it's a lot easier said than done in this situation if you have someone who does open up to you about what's happening for them, but it's not going to help if you panic. So as much as you can, remain calm and let them know that, thank you for being honest with me. I'm here to support you as much as you can. Once someone started to share how they're feeling, listening is the most important thing. Like I've said, it's not offering advice, it's not trying to kind of fix the problems, and that's difficult because as in our nature, we want to solve problems, we want to help people, and we think helping people is fixing the problem. But ultimately, this is not your problem to fix. All you're there to do is to listen and to give that person space to talk. It's really difficult to ignore your natural instinct, but your role here, like I said, is to support, not to solve. If you believe someone is in immediate danger, the most important thing you can do is contact the emergency services via 999 if you are concerned about someone in the immediate short term. If you are able to, offer your support and encourage them to seek professional help. So you could say something like, I'm really glad that you told me, let's figure out how we can get you some help. Sometimes just sitting beside them while they make a phone call, or making the call first and then passing on the phone, can also be a really helpful thing to do, because taking that first step to ring and ask for help is a really difficult thing to do, no matter what you're feeling, you know. And if you are in that extreme crisis and you feel the judgment and you feel concerned about what people are going to say, it's really hard to open up. So once they've trusted you, it can be helpful, even if you ring the 116 123 for the Samaritans and pass them the phone. That's a really helpful thing you could do. When they're able to think about next steps, you know, you can suggest a time for you to follow up. You can say, I'll ring you tomorrow, or I'll text you tomorrow to check in. And that just reinforces that feeling of that you care about them. It reminds people that they do have people who are caring for them. But that's not to say that they are now your responsibility. And if you need to take a break because it's a very heavy disclosure, you should absolutely do that. Adam, is there anything else you'd like to add here as part of kind of what people could do after a disclosure?
Yeah, again, just to sort of reiterate the point we made earlier, that the expectation isn't that you will solve the problem, even though sometimes somebody may ask you to do that, because it's almost like the burden goes from them to you, but that's obviously not your role here. And as Lizzie said, that the solution may seem obvious to us. Why don't you just do this? Or how about you go and do that? But that might not be the right solution for them at that time. So really, the way that we can be most supportive is to try and understand their frame of reference, understand what it is they're currently struggling with, and then begin to offer methods of support for help. As we've said, that might be just to simply give a phone number, or to make sure that there's somebody around them that can support them when you have to go. We should make the distinction between just trying to manage the crisis as it happens. So sometimes somebody may be in an acute crisis, and that problem needs solving right there through possibly emergency service or crisis teams. But then after the crisis, there still may be a need for support. So sometimes it's just about managing things in the moment. And then sometimes the support can be a bit more planned. And the thing about helping is it's dependent on the context within which it happens. So if it's somebody at home, then you might pull in other resources around you. So people that the person trusts, or they have a particularly good relationship with, or other family members. Or if it's a work colleague, there may be some mechanisms at work to support that person both immediately in the crisis and afterwards. What we want to try and do quite early on is look at protective factors. So we've spent quite a bit of time talking about the risk factors, but people also have protective factors, and maybe you're their protective factor. Maybe you're the person that they trust to tell you the information, and that's quite a lot of pressure for you, but maybe there's other people that you can build a network around for support. So early on, when we're thinking about how to support someone through a crisis, we think of protective factors, and those are things that are going to, really support the person to stay safe and then to seek support afterwards. So it's important to think about protective factors as well during this discussion.
Absolutely. Thanks, Adam. I also think as well, it's important to say it's okay if you feel awful after having that conversation with somebody. It's a really hard thing to hear someone tell you that they're feeling or having thoughts about suicide, and it can weigh really heavy on you. And if that has happened, Samaritans are not just a crisis helpline. They are available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to talk to anyone. So if you are feeling really upset and not sure how to manage those feelings after someone's made a disclosure, do seek support for yourself as well, because I remember the first time someone told me, and I remember really feeling knocked sideways for a few days. And so it's important to make sure you take time to do something nice for yourself and look after yourself in that instance as well, because you've done a wonderful thing by having the conversation with someone, but it doesn't mean it's easy. And so take care of yourself after that as well. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about how we at Thrive can help people in this situation. So the Thrive app is designed to be a proactive tool in supporting mental health. And while we're not a crisis service, our app plays a crucial role in identifying when someone might be at risk. So our in-app screening process allows us to detect early signs of poor mental health, which means we can offer support and signposting to other resources before these symptoms reach a critical point. Our aim is to intervene early and prevent issues from escalating into a crisis. And so our app offers a range of evidence-based techniques and exercises that can help people manage their mental health day to day. And we believe this proactive approach is key in maintaining kind of good mental health and preventing more serious issues from developing. In instances where an individual is exhibiting signs of a potential mental health crisis, our app is designed to signpost them to immediate sources of support. And that might be providing information on emergency contacts, guiding them towards it or crisis services. But ultimately, we ensure that our users are never left without options when they need them most. And if you're not sure how that works for you, or you're interested in hearing more, please email the email address on screen, help@thrive.uk.com, and I'll pick those emails up. That video is going to continue playing, isn't it? Adam, do you have any closing thoughts for us on our bookmark slide?
Yeah, I mean, hopefully we'll sort of take a look at some of the questions that you've been sending through, and thank you for your comments in the chat section. It seems as though you're pretty aligned on some of the questions that we put to you, which is great. Yeah, just a sort of a bit of reflection about what we've discussed, just to sort of close the discussion. We realize that this is a really difficult topic to discuss, but it's important to keep discussing it. It's not just about today, it's about making sure that, you know, we carry on the discussion. That's really the way that we prevent suicide, by continuing to keep the discussion going and not just save it for today. Our view as a healthcare organization is that it's preventable. There's always something that you can do to try and reduce the risk associated with an adverse event like suicide or self-harm. And whether that's through, you know, a direct intervention, or whether it's simply through just being there to listen to somebody, those things can make a really big difference to people. Oftentimes, people tell us they feel most at risk where they don't get an opportunity to talk to someone else about the way that they feel, or that they've tried and they've felt invalidated, or that their concerns haven't been given sufficient credibility, so they haven't felt listened to. And those are things that don't require, you know, a set of skills or any particular training. It's just about giving a kind word or a gesture, or checking in, or simply just listening, as Lizzie said, can have such a profound difference to somebody who's experiencing a level of distress. So we shouldn't underestimate the power of just sort of being there for somebody. But it's a collective effort, isn't it, to make sure that where somebody needs help and support, we're curious enough to keep the conversation going. We're curious enough to check in with them to see how things are, and where they need the support and they can't quite organize it for themselves, then we can be a real advocate for them in being able to access support. Whether that's simply through giving one of these numbers that you see here, or having the conversation again as a check-in, or, as we've said, simply going along to an appointment with them. All those things can make such a huge difference to somebody's safety. So we just wanted to, close it with the slide that we put up at the start, just so you can take those numbers down and have them as a resource kit if you have those conversations with people, or if you're planning on having that conversation with someone.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll leave this slide up while we answer some questions as well, just to make sure that you can have time to take a note of them. And we'll send the recording round. So everyone who's registered, whether they've managed to make it live today or not, we'll send this recording round, which means you'll get a copy of the slides as well. I don't know if you can see the questions, Adam. A number of them I think might be better answered with your clinical head on rather than my less clinical head. So I think.
Yeah, no, thank you. There's a lot of questions, so I'm sorry if we don't get around to answering them all, but we'll do our best. There's one question about the pandemic. So what impact has COVID had on people's safety generally? And I think there's been a lot of research about post-COVID mental health. I'm still a practicing clinician involved in mental health services. And what we've seen is almost a pause in service delivery, which shifted from in-person to partly online and then back again into in-person. But there was a drop-off of support because people couldn't get to a clinic, or people couldn't access the services that they had before. And I think we're still kind of learning from that. But there's a well-established post-COVID mental health dip that is partly a result of pre-existing conditions and also as a result of COVID itself and the adjustment to it. And that, yeah, for sure has probably had an impact on people's risk and safety. So that was a good question around COVID. So there's a question about, are some of the support lines open 24/7? Some are, and some aren't. So I think it's important to sort of, when you're trying to support someone to access support, we need to make it as simple and as accessible as possible. So in the context of being a work colleague, it might be important to look at who in the organization has been identified as the support person, having their contact details, knowing how to get hold of them. They sound like simple things, but they're really important. If it's hard to try and find the source of support, people are less inclined to do it. So we need to make it as simple as possible for people to reach out for support. Calm, for example, is a service that operates 5 p.m. to midnight every day. Obviously, 12 until 8, that's the difficult period when people can't always get the support that they need. There's a question about supporting family and friends. Yes, I think we touched upon the wider impact of risk issues like this. So it obviously affects the person, but it affects people around them. It affects family members and work colleagues. So in the context of being an employee, we as an organisation have helped people with who've been affected by suicide as a group of work colleagues. So we've done some almost like critical incident debriefs. So we've supported the team that have been trying to support the person who's ended their life, and have supported them to adjust to that difficulty. So that's been trauma informed in a way, because obviously people have got really strong emotional reactions to an event like that, and they're not quite sure how to relate to each other as a result of what happened. Family members often need support in their own right, don't they, as a result of an event like this. And there are charitable organisations, as you've heard. Samaritans isn't just sort of for moments of crisis, it can be moments of distress. There are other organisations that are there specifically for family members who are affected by risk issues like this. You may find a local organisation that's run by family members who've experienced this issue. So there are carers or family forums that are there in a supportive capacity. Okay, just looking at other questions.
One here, oh sorry Adam, there's one here that
Yeah.
I thought might be helpful for people, which is, do you have any particular advice if you're not in the same location? So for example, helping a colleague in a remote team or a friend in a different part of the country.
Yeah. So we talked about isolate. Well, you mentioned isolation was a risk factor, wasn't it? So
Yeah.
oftentimes it's about trying to think about things that might put somebody at risk. And if you work remotely and you don't have a great connection with your team, it can feel quite isolating, and that in itself can be a risk issue. So if you're trying to support somebody remotely, I think a good thing to try and do beforehand is be aware of the services that are local to them, so that when you're offering advice and support in terms of where they might go to get support, you're aware of what happens locally. The good news about the things that you see on the screen is they're kind of easily accessible at any point in time. So it really doesn't matter where you are in the UK, you can access those supports remotely. Your local GP is somebody that you should go to as well, but there may be something quite local to you that could act as a protective factor. So I would suggest thinking about where the person is and what they can do to get support locally. You can anticipate potential difficulties with things like isolation. So if you see that somebody drops off social activity, or they're just not attending meetings, book check-ins with them. So have protected time with them built into the year, so once a week or once a month, so you know that you've got regular check-ins with them, so that you're not waiting for a risk issue to occur. You've got regular check-ins so that you know that you're going to have some contact with them.
Absolutely, thanks.
Okay, we've got a lot of questions.
Yeah, sorry everyone, there's a lot
Just
going through. There's some people asking about different contact numbers in different parts of the country. So someone asking about Wales specifically. I've typed a response to that. But if you are looking for kind of UK country, like Scotland, England, Ireland, Wales specific numbers, Mental Health UK have a good section on their website that provides you with contact numbers specifically for each part of the country, just to answer that question. Going through here. So trying to read them all. Somebody asking, Adam, I don't know if you're able to provide advice on this, but if this advice would be the same for someone living with dementia, either newly diagnosed or further on in their dementia journey.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about general advice that can't account for very specific things, but generally it's the same for everybody. But if there are specific issues that put that person at risk, then we need to think about that as well and make sure that in our advice that's accounted for. If you, I think there's a couple of questions about mental health conditions. So there's something about if there's a pre-existing mental health condition, you may be in touch with services. So you may have a care coordinator or a GP that's aware of your services, and that's a way to get specific support for that mental health condition. If you're not, as we heard at the start, then that might be a good opportunity to try and seek support through your GP or through some other mental health organization. But generally, the advice is the same, isn't it? Just about listening. That is kind of diagnostically blind. It doesn't matter what your diagnostic term is. This is about how you can respond to someone and understand what they're trying to tell you and how you can support them to try and access support.
Yeah, thank you. There's another question that I've just noticed there, which is if it's financial difficulty someone is going through but doesn't have any family or friends to support them, what aid is out there for them? I know that there are a number of specific organisations that provide mental health and money advice. I think one of them is called Mental Health and Money Advice Service, literally. So you could have a look at that. But also Step Change are a kind of financial advice and debt management support charity. And so if financial stress is the source of someone's distress, then it might be worth contacting those for support with the kind of financial advice. Thank you so much for your continued questions, everybody. Samaritans provide a confidential listening ear and safe space to talk through feelings and worries with a trained volunteer. If someone is at immediate risk, rather than signposting them, would calling 999 be more appropriate? I think.
Yeah, so that's quite difficult to answer without having the specific information. So one of the things that you might need to make a decision on is the immediacy of the risk. And what that means is if you're trying to support somebody, there's a decision to be made, isn't there, about whether or not you need to do something immediately or whether it can wait for support further down the line. It's difficult to answer that question without having the specific risk issues, but 999 is also able to give. It's not an advisory service, but I think erring on the side of caution, if you're not sure on calling them, they'd be able to sort of tell you whether or not it was an issue that was best addressed by emergency services or better addressed by someone else like Samaritans. Sometimes it's not clear. So you could, I think, err on the side of caution if you're not sure.
Somebody else, and I think, Adam, you'll be able to answer this one. Do the police still do wellness checks on individuals if there's a risk and if you have no way to contact someone?
Yeah, you can request a welfare check if you're unsure about somebody's welfare. So they still do that. They have changed their responses to people with mental health difficulties somewhat, which is a bit frustrating. But yes, you can still request a welfare check. So for example, if you were in touch with somebody and you were worried about them and they were remote and you were trying to call them and there wasn't anybody around locally to try and check on them, then you might think that it would be a good question to ask of welfare. Could you go and check on that person because I'm concerned about them and I can't get in touch with them?
Yeah, thank you. There are still a couple. Sorry, I'm just reading through them all and trying to make sure that we've answered as many as we can.
Yeah, there's something about sort of feeling as though some people can't access services when they are urgently looking for help. They've given up because of the response that they've got. Yeah, we do hear that sometimes, that it's been really difficult and there have been many barriers to get support, and the system is such within mental health care that maybe you have to be really at a crisis point to get support. And some sort of look what's available locally. So it's just not the traditional services through NHS, but there may be something locally through Mind or through a smaller organization or a charity locally that might be able to give you some support. IAPT, for example, Improving Access Psychological Therapies, do various things, including things like guided self-help, which is giving you some resources to support yourself whilst you're waiting to access a service. So there are different things. It's just about supporting the person to look around. And I understand that can be incredibly frustrating. The last thing you want to do when you want support is to have the challenge of trying to look around to get it. And I think all healthcare services are designed to try and make it as easy as possible to get support. So it might just be going back again and having a different conversation with someone else. But again, the GP is somebody that's really useful to go to because they kind of broker access to some of these other services. But in some parts of the country, they're self-referral as well. So you could refer yourself. That's another way to get help.
Yeah, and someone's just quite helpfully pointed out in the comments that you can now contact 111 as well for out of hours mental health support. They've recently added that on with something that you can access via 111. So the person's even helpfully pointed out that's 111 and then option 2 when you contact them. Okay. Any more questions, please do submit them via the Q&A option, or I am now, I think, caught up with the chat. Thank you very much, everyone, for your continued engagement as well. It's been really nice to see so many comments coming through. Any more questions? Just move on the slides. I have got the QR code here for downloading the Thrive app. If you do have access to the app, you can download it via this QR code and log in using your email address and your access code. If you are unsure of your access code or want to find out more, please contact us on help@thrive.uk.com and I will get back to you with more information. One more question just come through I've seen. Is CAM the best place for teenagers?
Sorry, what was that, Lizzie?
Is CAM the best place for teenagers? Campaign Against Living Miserably. Somebody asking if that's the best place or if there are other teenage support services we can signpost them to.
Yeah, I mean, there are others. I mean, I'm not suggesting CALM isn't appropriate, but Young Minds is a good website to go to see what's available locally. There's various things for children and younger people, and of course, if they're at school, there's resources within schools as well. So Young Minds is a good website to check out.
Okay. Any other questions? Please do send them through, or alternatively, like I said, you can email us help@thrive.uk.com. And I hope that this has been helpful for you. I've just seen a comment come through about a specific company's access code. If you email us, I will sort that out for you. Answering a few typed questions that we've got still popping through. Any more questions? We're still here answering them if you want to pop them in, or thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. That was really useful for us as well. Appreciate all your comments.
Yeah, absolutely.